Let's consider one more time how we are implementing the behavior to scroll the page to a particular timeline item when clicking on these our labels. And in order to implement that scrolling, we also had to assign a reference to the timeline component right here. And then we use this reference anytime we switch over to timeline page inside the navigate function. If this first conditional block executes, that means that we have clicked on the logo. And we're using that timeline ref in order to scroll the page to current timeline item. And the reason why we had to register that ref is that because the function that is responsible for scrolling the page to a particular timeline item is actually declared inside the timeline component right here. So we're using that ref to get access to this function to be able to call it outside of this component. But now we're going to change this behavior a little bit. So now we no longer have to assign this reference. We can get rid of this reference as well as of its import right here. And since this reference isn't going to be used anywhere else, we can go to router.js module and remove its declaration. So let's remove this line. But now we're no longer able to call the function scroll to our in this place because we don't have a reference to the timeline component. And in addition to that, this function navigate seems to be doing a lot of things. But in fact, it should only be responsible for one thing, which is navigating between pages. And now we're going to apply refactoring to this function. So it will only be responsible for switching between pages and also making sure that anytime we switch the page, scroll bar will always be located at the top of the page. And that's what this scroll into view method is responsible for. And that's actually all what this function is going to be doing. But after doing all these changes, we of course have to go to different places and appropriately refactor the code. So for example, let's go inside the logo component first. And here, when clicking on the logo, we execute that function navigate, but now it will not be enough, so we're gonna declare another local function inside this component, handle click. And in here, we're gonna paste that code that we just cut from navigate function and write the following ternary condition in this function. So first of all, when clicking on the logo, we have to check which page we're currently on. And if we're currently on page called timeline, that means we're not gonna have to do any navigation, but instead only scroll the page to a particular timeline item, specifically to current timeline item, and to do so, we can call that function scroll to our with no arguments. Otherwise, if we are being on another page, then while clicking on the logo, we of course have to navigate to the page timeline, which we can do by executing navigate function and specifying correct page name that we'd like to navigate to, like so. But here we also have the same problem because function scroll to our is not available to us because we previously removed that timeline ref. So what we have to do now is actually somehow make this function available for other components and modules to use. But before doing that, let's go back to the logo component and remove this commented code. So now let's register this function handle click as an event handler for this link and then import current page variable from router module. And what we're going to do next is actually make scroll to our function available to be used in this component. So right away, let's just import this function from timeline items module. This is the module we're about to move that function. So let's just go ahead and cut this function from the timeline component, switch over to timeline items module, and right here, we're going to paste that function and export it like this. And there is also this array of refs called timeline item refs, which we are referring in here. So we have to move declaration of this array also to timeline items module. So let's cut this declaration from the timeline component and paste it inside timeline items. Since this array of refs directly relates to timeline item resource, and this will be an appropriate place for this array to be declared in. Let's not forget and export this array as well. And let's see what else should be imported inside this component. We're also using in here function current hour, so let's scroll up and add an import statement for this function. We're importing this function from the functions module. And one more thing that we also have to add an import for is this midnight hour constant. One more time, let's scroll up and add this constant right here. And now all this data, timeline item refs array as well as scroll to our function, we should import inside the timeline component. So let's switch over to this component and add necessary imports. And the rest of the imports that are no longer used in this component can safely be removed. And now that we have access to scroll to our function, which we can, by the way, import directly from timeline items module, we no longer need to use this define expose macro in this component to provide access to scroll to our function to parent component. So we're going to remove this macro. And now if we'll check the result in the browser, we will see that while clicking on our labels, the page is still scrolled to particular timeline items. So our previous behavior is working fine. So when clicking on those our labels, we're executing this event handler, which is scroll to our function that we have previously imported directly from timeline items module inside this component. And also while clicking on the logo, the page will be scrolled to current timeline item, as we can see. So one more time, let's check how all this is working, starting from the logo component. So when we click on the logo, we're going to execute handle click function, which is going to check if we're currently being on the timeline page. Then we don't need to navigate anywhere, but instead we just have to scroll the page to current timeline item, which we're doing by executing scroll to our function in here. And just because we have previously moved declaration of this function inside timeline items module, we can easily gain access to this function by importing it directly within any component we need. And now let's consider another case. That is, when we are navigating to a timeline page, we have to be also automatically scrolled to current timeline item, but the scrolling in this case should be instant. And when we have this scenario, the other part of this condition executes, and we're calling function navigate in order to navigate to a different page. And if we take a look one more time at the declaration of navigate function, we can see that this function now contains only 2 lines, whereas previously it contained many more. So right now this function is only responsible for navigating to a different page, as well as ensuring that the scroll bar will be always on top of the page. And let's just go to the root component and take a look at the template. As we can see, this template currently looks pretty clean, but even this template has some room for improvement. So we're going to work on improving this template in upcoming lessons. And for now, let's go over several pages in our application and make sure we don't face any errors and everything is still working as expected. So as we can see, there are no errors. We can continue in the next lesson.